There are stories history chooses to remember, and stories it deliberately buries beneath layers of sanitized textbooks and commemorative stamps. What you think you know about Harriet Tubman, the heroic conductor of the Underground Railroad, the fearless liberator who guided 300 souls to freedom, is only half the truth. The other half was hidden in classified government documents that were sealed for a century, burned plantation ledgers whose ashes were swept away before investigators could examine them, and testimonies that were systematically destroyed by people who understood that some truths are too dangerous to survive. Tonight I'm going to tell you what really happened. During those years, she vanished from the historical record. What she actually did in the shadows between 1858 and 1860, when even her closest allies lost track of her movements. What made the most powerful men in America, senators, plantation owners, slave traders worth millions, terrified to speak her name aloud, even in private correspondence. Why Frederick Douglass burned an entire box of letters after her death, telling his secretary only that some secrets must die with those who kept them. This is not the sanitized version they taught you in school, where Tubman is reduced to a kindly woman leading people through the woods by starlight. This is the story of a strategic genius who understood that saving individuals would never be enough, who made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, and who orchestrated an act of sabotage so devastating that it sent shockwaves through the entire Southern economy. This is the story they never wanted you to hear, and after tonight, you'll understand why. By the spring of 1858, Harriet Tubman had already carved her name into the conscience of a divided nation. She had successfully guided 19 expeditions into slave territory, bringing approximately 300 people to freedom through a network of safe houses that stretched from Maryland to the Canadian border. The reward for her capture had climbed to $12,000, an astronomical sum that made her one of the most wanted fugitives in American history, worth more dead or alive than most free men would earn in a lifetime. But then something strange happened, something that even today historians struggle to explain with the fragmentary evidence that remains. She disappeared. For nearly 2 years, there were no reported rescues. No sightings along the usual routes, no rumors filtering through the network of safe houses and sympathetic conductors. The abolitionists who had worked with her, who had risked their own freedom to support her missions, grew increasingly concerned. Frederick Douglass, the most prominent black abolitionist in America, wrote at least 7 letters inquiring about her whereabouts, letters that were never answered or whose responses have been lost to history. William Still, the meticulous record-keeper of the Underground Railroad, who documented every person who passed through his Philadelphia station, noted in his journal on June 14, 1858, "Moses has gone silent in a manner most uncharacteristic and deeply troubling. Her last communication spoke of a different kind of work that must be done, but she provided no details. I fear for her safety, yet I also fear what she may be planning. She has always possessed a determination that borders on the reckless." The slaveholders, meanwhile, breathed easier for the first time in years. They assumed she had finally been caught and killed in secret, or perhaps had fled to Canada permanently, exhausted by years of dangerous work. Some whispered that she had been betrayed by someone in her own network, sold out for the massive reward. The wanted posters gradually came down from post office walls and courthouse doors. Slave patrols relaxed their vigilance slightly. The name Moses, the code name enslaved people used for Tubman, was spoken less frequently in the hushed conversations that took place in slave quarters after dark. They had no idea what she was actually doing, and that ignorance would cost them everything. The truth began with a meeting that took place in a basement in Philadelphia on a cold March evening in 1858. The location was a Quaker meeting house on a quiet street, chosen because Quakers were known abolitionists, and their gatherings attracted no suspicion. Present were Tubman, 3 men whose names were never recorded in any surviving document, and a white abolitionist named Thomas Garrett, a man who had already helped thousands of enslaved people escape and who would later estimate he had assisted over 2,700 freedom seekers during his lifetime. What was discussed in that room remained secret for over a century until a single letter surfaced in a private collection in 1967. The letter was part of an estate sale in Delaware, buried in a box of miscellaneous correspondence. A graduate student named Patricia Chen, researching Garrett's abolitionist activities, found it and immediately recognized its significance. She photographed several pages before the entire collection was purchased by an anonymous buyer for an undisclosed sum. A buyer who has never been identified and who ensured the original documents disappeared from public access within 48 hours. But before it vanished, Chen managed to capture one crucial page. The fragment, in Garrett's distinctive handwriting, read, "The plan she proposes is more dangerous than anything yet attempted by our network. If successful, it would strike at the very heart of the institution, not merely at its branches. It would create chaos in the slave markets, disrupt the breeding operations, and cast doubt on ownership claims across 3 states. But if she is caught, and the likelihood of capture is considerable, they will make an example of her that will echo through generations. They will not simply hang her. They will ensure her death is public, prolonged, and designed to terrify anyone who might follow her example. I have tried to dissuade her with every argument I possess. She will not be moved. She says she is tired of saving people one family at a time while the system grows stronger. She says it is time to attack the foundation, not the walls. What was this plan that made even hardened abolitionists, people who had dedicated their lives to fighting slavery, genuinely afraid? To understand, you need to know something about Harriet Tubman that history has deliberately softened, something that makes people uncomfortable even today. She was not simply brave or determined or faithful, though she was all those things. She was strategic, calculating, and when necessary, absolutely ruthless in pursuit of her goals. She carried a pistol on every rescue mission, a fact that is often mentioned but rarely explained. The gun wasn't just for slave catchers or bounty hunters. It was for the people she was rescuing. If someone in her group wanted to turn back, endangering everyone else through their fear or exhaustion, she would put the gun to their head and give them a choice. Continue to freedom or die right there in the woods. As she reportedly said, and this is documented in multiple sources, "You'll be free or die a slave, but you won't go back and betray the others." This was not a woman who made empty threats. This was not a woman who let sentiment override strategy. And this was not a woman who would be satisfied with incremental change when revolutionary action was possible. The plan she conceived in early 1858 was based on a simple but devastating observation. The Underground Railroad saved individuals and families, which was noble and necessary work. But for every person she freed, 10 more were born into bondage. The institution itself was not shrinking. It was growing, becoming more entrenched, more profitable, more defended by law and custom. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made the situation even worse, turning the entire nation into hunting ground and forcing even free states to participate in the recapture of escaped slaves. Tubman decided that saving individuals was no longer enough. She needed to attack the foundation of the system itself. Her target was information, specifically the records that made the slave economy function. The slave economy of the South ran on meticulous record-keeping that would impress even modern bureaucrats. Every plantation maintained detailed ledgers. Names, ages, family relationships, purchases, sales, births, deaths, medical conditions, skills, behavioral notes, and most importantly, valuations. These records were the legal proof of ownership. They were kept in fireproof safes when possible, guarded jealously, and used in courts to settle disputes, track down runaways, and establish inheritance claims. But there was another set of records, less well known outside the slave trading industry, that Tubman had learned about through her extensive network of informants. The breeding records. By the 1850s, with the international slave trade officially banned since 1808, the domestic slave trade had become a massive and highly organized industry. Enslaved people were being systematically bred like livestock, with detailed records kept of bloodlines, fertility rates, genetic traits, and family histories going back generations. Certain plantations specialized in this practice, operating what were essentially human breeding farms, where enslaved women were forced to bear children who would be sold for profit. The most valuable records tracked families across multiple generations, allowing traders to predict which children would grow into the most profitable workers, which women would be the most fertile, which men would produce the strongest offspring. These records included notes on temperament, intelligence, physical characteristics, health histories, and even personality traits that were believed to be hereditary. These records were kept in a central location, a nondescript 3-story brick office building in Richmond, Virginia, that served as the headquarters for the largest slave trading operation in the South. The company had reorganized several times, changing names to avoid the stigma associated with the original Franklin and Armfield partnership, but the function remained the same. This building was the nerve center of the domestic slave trade, processing thousands of transactions annually and maintaining the master database that allowed the entire system to function efficiently. Tubman's plan was to destroy these records, all of them, every ledger, every breeding chart, every genealogical document that reduced human beings to livestock pedigrees. It sounds almost absurdly simple when stated that way, but the implications were staggering. Without the breeding records, thousands of enslaved people would become legally ambiguous. Their ownership would be disputed in courts. Their valuations would be uncertain, making sales difficult and insurance claims impossible. The carefully constructed genealogies that allowed traders to sell children away from parents, to break up families with the justification that they were optimizing bloodlines, would be erased. The entire system would be thrown into chaos. But there was a problem, actually several problems, each seemingly insurmountable. First, the building was in the heart of Richmond, the capital of Virginia, surrounded by slave patrols, vigilant citizens who would report any suspicious activity, and a legal system that would show no mercy to anyone caught attacking the slave trade. This wasn't a plantation in the countryside where Tubman could slip in and out under cover of darkness, relying on her knowledge of the land and the cooperation of enslaved people who lived there. This would require something she had never attempted before, operating in plain sight, in a major city, in the very center of Confederate power. Second, even if she could destroy the central records, plantation owners maintained their own copies. The chaos would be temporary unless those records were also destroyed. She would need to coordinate simultaneous attacks across dozens of plantations in multiple states, a logistical nightmare that would require perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and a network of people willing to take enormous risks. Third, she would need to get inside the building, access the vault where the most important records were kept, and destroy everything before being discovered. The building had guards, locks, and security measures designed specifically to prevent theft or sabotage. Any one of these problems would have deterred most people. Tubman saw them as challenges to be solved. She would need help. She would need resources. She would need time to plan. And she would need to become someone else entirely, someone who could move through Richmond without attracting suspicion, someone who could gather intelligence, someone who could get close to the building and its routines. She would need to disappear. Harriet Tubman disappeared from the abolitionist circles of Philadelphia in April 1858. When she resurfaced 6 weeks later in Baltimore, even her closest associates didn't recognize her at first glance. She had transformed herself into an elderly house slave named Mary, complete with gray hair achieved through a mixture of ash and lard, a stooped posture that she maintained so consistently it became second nature, and the deferential manner of someone who had spent a lifetime in domestic service and learned to make herself invisible. The disguise was not just physical. She had studied the speech patterns, the gestures, the entire bearing of an older enslaved woman who posed no threat to anyone. The kind of person white people looked through rather than at. This was not her first disguise. She had posed as a man on several occasions, as a free woman with forged papers, even as a mentally disturbed person to avoid questioning during her rescue missions. But this was different. This persona needed to be sustainable for months, not days. It needed to withstand close scrutiny in an urban environment where people paid attention to strangers, where slave patrols checked papers regularly, where any inconsistency could lead to arrest and interrogation. She spent the summer of 1858 in Baltimore, working as a hired-out domestic servant. This was a common practice in border cities. Enslaved people whose owners lived elsewhere would be rented out to urban families for a weekly or monthly fee, with the money going to the owner. Mary came with impeccable references, forged documents that claimed she was owned by a widow named Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley in Delaware, who needed the income after her husband's death. The forgeries were the work of a free black man in Philadelphia who specialized in creating false papers. He was so skilled that his documents had never been detected, and he charged accordingly, $50 per complete set of papers, a fortune that Tubman had saved from her work as a cook and laundress during the periods between her rescue missions. But Tubman wasn't in Baltimore to work as a domestic servant. She was there to learn and to recruit. Through the network of enslaved domestics in the city, a network that was far more extensive and organized than most white people realized, she made contact with a man I'll call James. His real name was never recorded in any document that survived, and for good reason. What he did was dangerous enough that even decades after slavery ended, people who knew the truth chose to protect his identity. James was a literate enslaved man who worked as a clerk in a shipping office near the Baltimore docks. This was not uncommon in cities. Many enslaved people held positions that required education, though it was technically illegal in most southern states to teach them to read and write. James had been taught by his mother, who had been taught by a sympathetic owner's daughter before being sold south. He had hidden his literacy for years, pretending to be illiterate while secretly reading everything he could access. His position in the shipping office gave him something Tubman desperately needed: access to commercial records and shipping schedules. More importantly, he had connections throughout the domestic slave trade network. He knew which traders were moving people where, which auctions were scheduled, which plantations were buying and selling. And crucially, he knew about the Richmond office and the records it contained. Their first meeting took place in a cemetery after dark, a location chosen because enslaved people were often sent to tend family graves, and their presence there would not attract suspicion. Tubman, still in her Mary disguise, pretended to be tending a grave while James walked past slowly, speaking in a low voice without stopping or looking at her directly. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "I know what you've done, and I know you're planning something bigger than rescue missions." Tubman's hand moved toward the knife she kept hidden in her skirts, but she didn't draw it. "How do you know that?" "Because you've been asking questions. Careful questions, but questions nonetheless. About the Richmond office, about record keeping, about security measures." He paused at a gravestone, pretending to read the inscription. "What you're asking is suicide. That building has guards. The records are in a vault. Even if you could get inside, even if you could destroy the papers, they'd rebuild the records from plantation copies within months. You'd accomplish nothing except getting yourself killed." "Not if we destroy those copies too," Tubman replied. James stopped walking, turned to look at her directly for the first time, abandoning the pretense of casual conversation. "You're talking about hitting dozens of plantations simultaneously. That's impossible." "Is it?" What Tubman proposed over the next hour, speaking in whispers in that cemetery as darkness fell completely, was audacious to the point of madness. She wanted to organize a coordinated action across Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. On the same night, trusted people would set fire to the record rooms of major plantations while she and a small team hit the central office in Richmond. The fires would be set to look accidental: a knocked-over lamp, a careless spark from a fireplace, a candle left too close to papers. Nothing that would immediately point to organized sabotage. The key was timing and communication. It would require a network of people willing to take enormous risks, perfect coordination without telegraphs or written messages that could be intercepted, and absolute secrecy. If even one person was caught and talked, the entire operation would collapse. James told her it couldn't be done. Then he spent the next 3 months helping her do it. The network they built was unlike anything the Underground Railroad had attempted before. It wasn't designed to move people north to freedom. It was designed to move information and coordinate action across hundreds of miles, using methods that left no paper trail and could not be intercepted by authorities. They used songs, specific spirituals sung in specific ways that would be passed from plantation to plantation by enslaved people who traveled with their owners or were hired out to work in different locations. The songs contained coded information about timing and targets, hidden in verses that sounded like ordinary religious music to anyone who didn't know the code. A particular verse sung at a particular tempo meant 2 weeks from Sunday. A different verse meant wait for the next signal. A change in the usual melody indicated danger or a need to abort. The beauty of this system was that singing was expected, even encouraged, among enslaved people. Spirituals were sung during work, during worship, during any gathering. No one would suspect that the songs carried messages. They used quilts hung on clotheslines, with patterns that meant different things to those who knew how to read them. A particular arrangement of squares indicated a safe house. A different pattern warned of danger. These quilts were common sights in every community, and the patterns changed frequently enough that they could convey updated information without attracting suspicion. They used the movement of goods along trade routes with marked crates that told people where to look for hidden messages. A particular scratch on a wooden crate, a specific knot in a rope, a certain arrangement of items in a wagon. All of these could carry meaning to those who knew the code. And they recruited carefully. Not freedom seekers who wanted to escape north, but people who were willing to stay enslaved, to remain in place and take action when the signal came. People who understood they might never escape themselves, but could strike a blow against the system. People who were willing to risk everything for a cause larger than their own freedom. This was perhaps the most difficult part of the operation. Tubman had to identify people who possessed the right combination of courage, discretion, and strategic thinking. She had to approach them carefully, revealing only as much as necessary, always prepared for the possibility of betrayal. She had to trust her instincts about human nature, knowing that one wrong choice could doom the entire plan. By November 1858, the network was in place. Tubman had identified 43 plantations with vulnerable record rooms, places where the documents were kept in wooden buildings or offices that could be set on fire without endangering the main house or the slave quarters. She had people positioned at each one waiting for the signal, and she had assembled a team of 5 people who would go with her into Richmond. But there was still the problem of the vault. The central office kept its most important records in a fireproof safe manufactured by the Herring Safe Company of New York. It was state-of-the-art technology for the time, designed to withstand not just fire, but also physical attacks. The safe had a combination lock that was considered unpickable, walls thick enough to resist drilling, and a design that would cause the locking mechanism to jam permanently if someone tried to force it open. There was no way to break into it, and even if they could, the noise would alert the guards who patrolled the building. Tubman needed someone who could open it properly. She needed the combination. This is where the story takes a turn that seems almost too convenient to be true, the kind of coincidence that would be rejected as unrealistic in fiction, except that it's documented in multiple sources, corroborated by letters and testimonies that were given years later after the Civil War had ended and people felt safe enough to speak about what they had done. In December 1858, a white man named Robert Harrington approached Thomas Garrett in Philadelphia. Harrington was a locksmith and safe technician who had done work for various businesses throughout the mid-Atlantic region, including slave traders. He had installed the safe in the Richmond office 3 years earlier, along with similar safes in several other locations. He wanted to help the abolitionist cause, and he had kept copies of the combinations to every safe he'd ever installed. When Garrett told Tubman about Harrington, she was immediately suspicious. It seemed too perfect, too convenient. In her experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. She spent weeks investigating the man, having him followed by people she trusted, testing him with false information to see if it would leak to authorities or slave traders. She learned that Harrington was exactly what he claimed to be, a skilled locksmith who had recently experienced a crisis of conscience. The catalyst had been a slave auction he witnessed in Richmond while installing a safe in a nearby building. He had watched as a mother was separated from her 3 children, each sold to different buyers. The woman's screams had haunted him for weeks afterward. Finally, Tubman agreed to meet with him personally in a safe house in Philadelphia. The meeting took place on a January evening, with snow falling outside and a fire burning in the fireplace. Garrett was present as a witness and mediator. "Why now?" Tubman asked him directly, studying his face for any sign of deception. "You've installed these safes for years. You've profited from this system. You've helped slave traders protect their records and their money. Why help us now?" Harrington's answer was simple and devastating. "I have a daughter. She's 7 years old. Last month she asked me what I do for work, where I go when I travel. I realized I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't tell her that I help keep people in chains, that I make money from human misery. I couldn't look at her innocent face and explain that her comfortable life is built on the suffering of children just like her. So I'm here. I can't undo what I've done, but I can try to make it right." Whether his motives were genuine or not, and Tubman never fully trusted him, she decided to use the information he provided. But she didn't tell him the full plan. She told him she wanted the combination to help forge freedom papers, to create documents that would help people escape. He gave her the combination and several other pieces of useful information about the building's layout and security measures, believing he was helping with forgeries and perhaps small-scale theft. He had no idea what was really about to happen, and Tubman made sure he would never know, never be implicated, never face consequences for his assistance. She protected him the same way she protected everyone in her network, through compartmentalization and careful management of information. By January 1859, everything was in place. The network was ready, spread across 3 states like an invisible web. The team was assembled, each person carefully chosen and prepared for their role. The combination was secured and verified. All that remained was to choose the date and give the signal. Tubman chose February 23rd, 1859. It was a Wednesday, the middle of the week when people would be least alert, when routines would be most predictable. There would be no moon that night. She had consulted almanacs to ensure complete darkness. And it was exactly 1 week before a major slave auction in Richmond that would bring traders from across the South to the city, meaning the records would be in heavy use and the office would be fully stocked with the most current information. The signal went out through the network in early February. A spiritual called "Steal Away to Jesus" was sung at a particular cadence in a particular church in Baltimore. From there, it spread south along the trade routes, carried by enslaved people who traveled with their owners, by hired-out workers who moved between cities, by those who had permission to visit family on other plantations. Within 2 weeks, 43 people across 3 states knew that on February 23rd at midnight, they were to act. None of them knew about the others. Each believed they were acting alone, striking an individual blow against their own oppressors. That was Tubman's genius. If one was caught and tortured for information, they couldn't betray a network they didn't know existed. They could only reveal their own actions, which would be dismissed as an isolated incident, a single act of rebellion, rather than a coordinated campaign. Harriet Tubman arrived in Richmond on February 20th, 1859, still in her disguise as the elderly Mary. She came by train, sitting in the segregated car reserved for enslaved people and free blacks, her papers carefully prepared and her story rehearsed until it was second nature. The papers claimed she was being hired out to a family named the Prescotts, who lived in a respectable neighborhood near the Capitol building. The Prescotts didn't exist, but the papers were good enough to pass inspection at the checkpoints that controlled entry into the city. Richmond was paranoid about slave rebellions, especially after Nat Turner's uprising in 1831, and the authorities checked everyone who entered. The city itself was a strange mixture of elegance and brutality. Grand houses lined the main streets, their columns and porticos designed to evoke ancient Greece and Rome. Well-dressed white people strolled along sidewalks, attended by enslaved servants who carried packages and opened doors. Churches with tall steeples dominated the skyline, their bells marking the hours. But beneath this veneer of civilization was a city built on human trafficking. Richmond was one of the largest slave trading centers in the South, second only to New Orleans. Auction houses operated openly on main streets. Enslaved people were marched through the city in chains, from the train station to the holding pens where they would wait to be sold. The smell of the city, a mixture of coal smoke, horse manure, and human misery, was something Tubman would remember for the rest of her life. She found lodging in a boarding house that catered to hired-out enslaved people, a common arrangement in the city. For a small fee paid by their supposed owners, enslaved people could rent a bed in a crowded room and receive minimal meals. The boarding house was run by a free black woman named Catherine, who asked no questions and kept no records beyond what was legally required. Tubman spent her first day in Richmond, simply observing, moving through the city with the shuffling gait of elderly Mary, running errands that gave her a reason to be on the streets. She noted the locations of slave patrols, the timing of their rounds, the areas where they were most vigilant. She identified escape routes, places where she could hide if pursued, buildings with multiple exits. And she studied the target building. The office that housed the slave trading company's central records was a 3-story brick structure on a commercial street near the docks. The ground floor was a public office where traders conducted business during the day, buying and selling enslaved people, arranging transportation, negotiating prices. The second floor contained administrative offices where clerks processed paperwork and maintained routine records. The third floor, accessible only by a locked stairway, housed the vault and the most sensitive records. The breeding charts, the genealogies, the documents that were too valuable to risk in the public areas. There were 2 guards who worked in shifts, one during the day and one at night. The day guard was a young man who took his job seriously, checking everyone who entered, maintaining a visible presence. The night guard was a man in his 50s named William Hodges, who had a reputation for drinking. He would make rounds every hour, checking the doors and windows, then return to a small room on the first floor where he kept a bottle hidden in a desk drawer. Tubman spent 3 days observing Hodges and his routine. She noted that he was most inattentive during his 3rd round around midnight, when he'd had enough to drink to be careless, but not so much that he'd passed out. He would check the doors perfunctorily, sometimes skipping the back entrance entirely, then return to his room and his bottle. That would be their window. 30 minutes, perhaps 40 if they were lucky, to get inside, reach the 3rd floor, open the vault, and set the fire. A team arrived separately over the next 2 days, each with their own cover story, each lodging in different locations. There was James, the clerk from Baltimore, who came to Richmond on legitimate business for his employer. A woman I'll call Sarah, who had worked as a house slave in Richmond years earlier and knew the city's geography intimately. 2 brothers, former sailors named Thomas and William, who had experience with fires and knew how to make them spread quickly while appearing accidental. And a teenage boy named Daniel, sharp-eyed and quick, who would serve as their lookout and messenger. They never met as a group. That would have been too suspicious, too dangerous. Instead, they communicated through dead drops, messages left in predetermined locations, picked up without acknowledgement. A loose brick in a particular wall, a hollow tree in a cemetery, a crack between floorboards in a church where enslaved people were allowed to worship. The messages were written in a code that Tubman had developed, a mixture of symbols and abbreviated words that would be meaningless to anyone who intercepted them. Even if someone found a message, it would appear to be random scratches or the idle doodles of someone barely literate. On February 22nd, the day before the planned action, Tubman made her final reconnaissance of the building. She walked past it 3 times during the day, noting the positions of windows, the type of locks on the doors, the presence of any new security measures. In the evening, she watched from a distance as Hodges began his shift, confirming that his routine hadn't changed. Everything was ready. The network across 3 states was waiting for the signal. Her team in Richmond was in position. The combination to the vault was memorized. The materials for starting the fire were prepared and hidden in locations where they could be quickly retrieved. But Tubman couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the boarding house, listening to the sounds of the city, distant voices, the rattle of wagons, the bark of dogs. She thought about all the things that could go wrong. A guard changing his routine, a patrol passing at the wrong moment, someone in the network losing their nerve or being discovered, the combination not working, the fire spreading too quickly and trapping them inside. She thought about the people she had recruited, the 43 individuals across 3 states who would be taking action in a few hours. She didn't know most of their names. She had never met most of them in person, but she had asked them to risk everything, and some of them would almost certainly be caught. Some of them would be tortured for information. Some of them would die. Was it worth it? Would destroying records really make a difference, or was she deluding herself, striking a symbolic blow that would accomplish nothing except getting people killed? She thought about the alternative, continuing to rescue people 1 family at a time while the system grew stronger, while more children were born into bondage, while the breeding farms continued to operate, and the traders continued to profit. She thought about the woman Robert Harrington had seen at the auction, screaming as her children were sold away. She thought about the thousands of similar scenes that played out every day across the South. And she knew she had to try. Even if it failed, even if she died in the attempt, she had to try. February 23rd arrived cold and clear. Tubman spent the day working at the boarding house, maintaining her Mary persona, showing no sign of nervousness or anticipation. She helped Catherine prepare meals, swept floors, carried water. She moved slowly like an old woman whose body ached from a lifetime of labor. As evening fell, she complained of feeling unwell and retired early to her room. Catherine, who may have suspected something but asked no questions, brought her a cup of tea and wished her a good rest. At 11 o'clock, Tubman slipped out through a window. The city was quiet but not empty. Even at night there were people on the streets, late workers heading home, men leaving taverns, slave patrols making their rounds. Tubman moved slowly, maintaining her elderly shuffle, just another enslaved person running a late errand for her owner. She carried a small basket, as if she'd been sent to deliver something or fetch medicine. She met James 2 blocks from the Target building, in an alley behind a warehouse. He handed her a small bag containing the tools they would need. A dark lantern that could be shuttered to hide its light, a set of lockpicks that he had made himself, and materials for starting a fire that would burn hot and fast, a mixture of chemicals that, when combined, would create an intense heat that would ensure complete combustion of paper. "The others are in position," James whispered. "Sarah is watching the guard from across the street. The brothers are at the back entrance, ready to move when we signal. Daniel is at the corner, ready to warn us if patrols come." Tubman nodded. "And the plantations? If the network held, they're ready. We'll know by morning whether the signals reached everyone." They moved to a shadowed doorway across from the building and waited. At 11:47, right on schedule, Hodges emerged for his 3rd round. They watched him check the front door, walk around the building with his lantern, check the back entrance. He moved slowly, without urgency, a man going through familiar motions. At 12:03, he returned to his room on the 1st floor. Through the window, they could see him sit down at his desk and reach for the drawer where he kept his bottle. At 12:10, Tubman and James crossed the street. The back door lock was simple. James had it open in less than a minute, his practiced fingers working the picks with a confidence born of experience. They slipped inside, closing the door silently behind them. The interior was dark except for a faint glow from Hodges's room at the front of the building. They could hear him in there, the clink of a bottle against glass, a heavy sigh, the creak of a chair as he settled in for another hour of drinking away his boredom. The stairway to the third floor was locked, as expected. This lock was more complex, designed to prevent unauthorized access to the most valuable records. James knelt beside it, shielding his work with his body while Tubman kept watch. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud in the silence, and the distant sounds of the city outside. It took James 4 minutes to open the lock, 4 minutes during which every sound seemed impossibly loud, every creak of the building like a gunshot, every breath like a shout. Tubman's hand rested on the knife in her belt, ready to fight if they were discovered, knowing that fighting would mean death but determined not to be taken alive. The lock clicked open. They climbed the stairs, moving slowly to avoid making noise, testing each step before putting their full weight on it. The third floor was a single large room lined with filing cabinets and shelves. At the far end stood the safe, exactly as Robert Harrington had described it, a massive iron box, painted black, with the Herring Safe Company logo on the door. Tubman approached it, while James kept watch at the stairs, listening for any sound from below. She pulled out the paper with the combination, shielded the lantern to focus its light on the dial, and began to turn it with careful precision. Right to 23, left to 41, right to 17, left to 8. The safe didn't open. Tubman felt ice in her stomach. Had Harrington given them the wrong combination? Had it been changed since he installed the safe? Had this entire plan, months of preparation, all the risks taken by dozens of people, been for nothing? She tried again, moving more slowly, making sure she hit each number precisely, listening for the subtle clicks that would indicate the mechanism was engaging properly. Right to 23, left to 41, right to 17, left to 8. Nothing. Tubman closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite the fear and frustration. She remembered Harrington's instructions, his explanation of how the safe worked. He had mentioned something about the dial needing to be turned past each number before returning to it, to ensure the mechanism fully engaged. She tried a third time, this time turning the dial past each number by a full rotation before coming back to it. This time she heard it, a soft click, different from the sound of the dial turning. The handle turned. The safe door swung open. Inside were ledgers, dozens of them, bound in leather, their pages filled with names and numbers and the careful documentation of human misery. Birth records, death records, sale records, breeding records. The accumulated data of thousands of enslaved lives, reduced to columns and calculations, to predictions about fertility and strength and profitability. Tubman pulled them out, stacking them on the floor. James came over to help, and together they emptied the safe. Then they moved to the filing cabinets, pulling out drawers, adding more papers to the pile. They worked quickly but methodically, focusing on the documents that couldn't be easily replaced. The breeding records and genealogies that existed nowhere else. The master copies that all other records were based on. When they had gathered everything from the safe and the most important cabinets, Tubman pulled out the fire-starting materials. These were not simple matches. They were chemical compounds that, when mixed, would create an intense heat that would ensure complete combustion of the papers, reducing them to ash so fine that nothing could be recovered or reconstructed. She was about to apply them when James grabbed her arm. "Wait," he whispered urgently. "Listen." From downstairs came the sound of the front door opening. Voices, multiple people, men laughing, talking loudly. Hodges was talking to someone. No, he was talking to several people, and they were coming inside. Tubman and James froze, their eyes meeting in the dim light of the shuttered lantern. They were on the third floor with no way out except the stairs they'd come up. If whoever was down there decided to come up, they would be trapped. The voices continued, clearer now. Tubman could make out words. "Thought you might want some company on this cold night. Brought some cards and a bottle of the good stuff. Nobody's going to rob this place. Might as well make the time pass pleasantly." Hodges was entertaining visitors, perhaps other guards from nearby buildings, stopping by for a drink and some conversation. It wasn't uncommon. Tubman had observed similar social calls during her surveillance, though never this late at night. But it meant they couldn't leave. Not yet. Any sound on the stairs would be heard. They would have to wait until the visitors left, which could be minutes or could be hours. Tubman looked at the pile of records, then at the windows. They were on the 3rd floor, too high to jump without serious injury. Even if they could get out, they couldn't take the records with them, and without destroying them, the entire mission would fail. She made a decision. She applied the chemical compounds to the papers, working quickly and silently. The mixture would take several minutes to ignite, enough time for them to get downstairs and out, but not enough time to warn anyone or stop the fire once it started. It was a calculated risk. If the visitors stayed too long, the fire would start while Tubman and James were still in the building. But if they waited for the visitors to leave, they might not have time to complete the mission before Hodges made his next round. Then she and James moved to the stairs and waited in the darkness, listening to the conversation below. 5 minutes passed. 10. The visitors showed no sign of leaving. They had settled in for a long night of drinking and cards. Tubman checked her pocket watch, tilting it toward the faint light from the lantern. 12:47. The chemicals would ignite in less than 3 minutes. At 12:49 she heard one of the visitors say goodnight, footsteps toward the door. But the others stayed, still talking with Hodges, their voices slurred with alcohol. 12:50. Another visitor left. 2 remained, plus Hodges. 12:51. Tubman smelled it before she saw it, a sharp, acrid scent as the chemicals began to react. In seconds, the papers would burst into flame. She looked at James. He understood. They couldn't wait any longer. They would have to risk it. They started down the stairs, moving as quietly as possible. Behind them, the first flames appeared, small but growing rapidly as the chemical reaction accelerated. They reached the 2nd floor landing. The voices below continued oblivious. Tubman could hear cards being shuffled, glasses clinking, laughter. They reached the 1st floor. Hodges' room was to their right, the back door straight ahead. 20 feet. 15. Behind them, on the 3rd floor, the fire found the main pile of records. The chemical reaction accelerated dramatically. Flames shot up, reaching the wooden ceiling beams, spreading with unnatural speed. 10 feet from the back door. "What's that smell?" one of the visitors said, his voice suddenly alert. 5 feet. "Is something burning?" Tubman and James reached the back door. James's hand was on the handle when they heard Hodges shout, "Fire! The building's on fire!" They burst through the door into the alley. Behind them came the sounds of chaos, shouting, running footsteps, the guard and his visitors rushing toward the stairs, then stopping as they saw the flames already consuming the 3rd floor. Tubman and James ran, abandoning their careful elderly shuffle, sprinting through the dark streets. Behind them, flames were already visible in the 3rd floor windows, growing brighter by the second, casting an orange glow over the surrounding buildings. They split up at the first intersection, each heading to a different safe house as planned. The plan was to lie low for several hours, then leave the city separately before dawn, using different routes and different cover stories. Tubman made it to her safe house, a storage room behind a blacksmith shop, arranged by Sarah, who had connections throughout the city's black community. She collapsed against the wall, her heart pounding, her hands shaking with the aftermath of fear and exertion. She had done it. The records were burning. The safe was empty. The breeding charts and genealogies were being reduced to ash. But had the network succeeded? Had the plantation fires been set? Or had she destroyed the central records only to have them rebuilt from plantation copies? She would have to wait until morning to find out. And morning seemed very far away. The fire in Richmond was discovered quickly enough that the building was saved from complete destruction. But the 3rd floor was a total loss. The safe, though fireproof on the outside, had been left open, and its contents were reduced to ash so fine that it could have been blown away by a breath. The filing cabinets that Tubman and James had emptied were also complete losses, their contents consumed by flames that burned with an intensity that suggested accelerants had been used. The guard, Hodges, and his two visitors managed to escape unharmed, though Hodges was immediately suspected of negligence and faced intense questioning. He claimed he had smelled nothing, seen nothing, until the fire was already raging. An investigation was launched, but with no evidence of forced entry. James had been careful to relock the doors behind them. And Hodges's well-known reputation for drinking, the official conclusion was that he had knocked over a lamp or dropped a cigar while making his rounds on the third floor. No one suspected arson. No one connected it to the Underground Railroad or to any organized resistance. It was simply a tragic accident that had destroyed valuable property records. The slave trading company would have to rebuild its database from plantation copies, which would be expensive and time-consuming but not impossible. That was the conclusion on February 24th, when the sun rose over Richmond and revealed the smoke-damaged building. But that conclusion didn't last long. Over the next 3 days, reports began to filter into Richmond from across Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. Plantation after plantation reported fires in their record rooms. Some were small, contained quickly with minimal damage. Others destroyed entire outbuildings, consuming decades of carefully maintained records. The reports came in slowly at first, carried by messengers and mail coaches, then with increasing frequency, as the pattern became impossible to ignore. In Henrico County, Virginia, the Whitfield plantation reported that their record room had burned on the night of February 23rd. The fire had started around midnight, apparently from a knocked-over lamp. The overseer's records, including breeding charts going back 20 years, were completely destroyed. In Caroline County, Virginia, the Thornton plantation reported a similar fire, also on February 23rd, also around midnight. The slave quarters were unharmed, but the office where records were kept was gutted. In Hanover County, the Patterson plantation. In Chesterfield County, the Reynolds plantation. In Prince George County, the Mitchell plantation. The reports kept coming. Each one described a fire that started late on February 23rd or in the early hours of February 24. Each one destroyed record rooms while leaving the main houses and slave quarters largely untouched. Each one was attributed to accident: a careless lamp, a spark from a fireplace, a candle left burning. By February 27th, the pattern was impossible to miss. Slave owners and traders quickly realized this was not a series of unfortunate coincidences. This was coordinated sabotage on a scale never before attempted in American history. Panic spread through the planter class, like the fires that had consumed their records. Emergency meetings were called in Richmond, in Raleigh, in Baltimore. Militias were mobilized. Slave patrols were doubled, then tripled. Every enslaved person who had been anywhere near a record room on the night of February 23rd was questioned, threatened, beaten for information. The interrogations were brutal. Overseers and slave catchers used every method they knew to extract confessions: whipping, branding, waterboarding, threats against family members. They were certain that such a coordinated action required extensive planning and communication, and they were determined to uncover the network responsible. But the network held. The people who had set the fires knew nothing about each other. They couldn't betray what they didn't know. And Tubman had been careful to recruit people who were skilled at deception, at maintaining their composure under pressure, at hiding their true thoughts and feelings behind the mask of submission that enslaved people wore for survival. A few were caught. A man named Peter in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, was seen near the record room shortly before the fire started. He was hanged without trial, his body left hanging as a warning to others. A woman named Hannah in Dorchester County, Maryland, was accused based on nothing more than suspicion and the fact that she had been heard singing "Steal Away to Jesus" in the days before the fire. She was sold south, separated from her husband and children, disappeared into the vast machinery of the domestic slave trade. But most of the network survived. They maintained their innocence, expressed shock and horror at the fires, and continued their daily routines as if nothing had happened. They grieved privately for those who were caught, but they didn't break, and the damage was done. In total, 37 of the 43 targeted plantations experienced fires on the night of February 23rd or in the early morning hours of February 24th. 6 of the network members had either lost their nerve at the last moment or been unable to act due to circumstances beyond their control: an overseer who happened to be working late, a locked door they couldn't open, a patrol that passed at the wrong time. But 37 successes out of 43 was beyond anything Tubman had dared hope for. Combined with the destruction of the central records in Richmond, it represented a devastating blow to the slave trading industry. The breeding records were gone. The genealogies that had been maintained for generations were destroyed. The careful documentation that allowed traders to track bloodlines and predict the value of children not yet born was reduced to ash and memory. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Slave auctions scheduled for March were postponed or cancelled. Traders couldn't verify the provenance of the people they were selling. Buyers refused to pay premium prices for enslaved people whose lineage couldn't be documented. The breeding farms, which had been highly profitable operations, suddenly found their business model in ruins. Without records to prove that a particular woman came from a fertile line or that a particular man had strong bloodlines, they couldn't command the prices that had made the breeding operations worthwhile. Legal disputes erupted across the South. Ownership claims became impossible to prove when the records that documented purchases and inheritances were destroyed. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, arguing that the fires were suspicious and possibly the result of owner negligence. Banks called in loans that had been secured by enslaved people whose value could no longer be verified. The slave trading company in Richmond never recovered. Within a year, it had dissolved, its partners bankrupt, its reputation destroyed. Other trading firms struggled to rebuild their records from fragmentary plantation copies and from memory, but the central database was gone forever. The efficiency and organization that had made the domestic slave trade so profitable was shattered. Historians have estimated that the fires of February 1859 caused between $2 and $3 million in economic damage, equivalent to over $60 million today. More importantly, they created legal chaos that persisted for years, with thousands of ownership disputes clogging the courts, tying up capital, and making the slave trade less profitable and more risky. But there was another consequence that Tubman hadn't fully anticipated, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The fires terrified the planter class in a way that individual escapes never had. This wasn't enslaved people running away, seeking their own freedom. This was enslaved people fighting back, organizing, striking at the system itself. It suggested a level of coordination and capability that challenged every assumption about the docility and ignorance of enslaved populations. And the response was brutal. Across the South, laws were tightened. Literacy among enslaved people, already illegal in most states, was prosecuted more aggressively. Anyone caught teaching an enslaved person to read or write faced severe penalties. Gatherings of enslaved people were restricted. No more than 5 could meet without white supervision. The hiring out system that had allowed enslaved people some freedom of movement in cities was curtailed. Passes were required for any travel, and the penalties for being caught without proper documentation were increased. Punishments for even minor infractions became more severe. Overseers, frightened by the evidence of organized resistance, cracked down harder on any sign of independence or defiance. The violence that had always been part of slavery intensified. In trying to strike a blow against the system, Tubman had inadvertently made life harder for millions of enslaved people in the short term. The planter class, frightened and angry, took out their fear on the people they controlled. Tubman understood this. Years later, after the Civil War, she reflected on the events of 1859 in a letter to a friend. The letter was discovered in an archive in the 1950s, and it reveals the moral complexity of her decision. I thought I could hurt the system without hurting the people. I was wrong. They made the people pay for what I'd done. Every new restriction, every new cruelty, every tightening of the chains, that weight is mine to carry. I see their faces sometimes, the ones who suffered because of what I set in motion. I hear their cries in my dreams. But I also know this: the system was already dying. It just didn't know it yet. What we did in Richmond, what those brave souls did on those plantations, we showed that enslaved people could organize, could plan, could strike back. We showed that the system wasn't as strong as it pretended to be. We showed that the foundation could be shaken. Did it hasten the end? I believe it did. I believe it helped bring the war closer. And the war brought freedom. But the cost? The cost was paid by people who never chose to be part of my plan, who never knew what I was doing, who suffered for my decisions. That's the burden of choosing to fight. You don't just risk yourself. You risk everyone. And you have to live with that. Whether she was right, whether the fires actually hastened the end of slavery or simply caused suffering without meaningful change, is a question historians still debate. Harriet Tubman left Richmond before dawn on February 24th, traveling north through a network of safe houses that had been arranged in advance. She moved as the elderly Mary, carrying papers that identified her as returning to her owner in Delaware after a month of hired work in Richmond. She traveled by foot, by wagon, by train, always maintaining her disguise, always alert for any sign that she was being followed or suspected. The journey took 5 days during which she had no way of knowing whether the plantation fires had succeeded, whether her team had escaped safely, whether the authorities were connecting the dots. She reached Philadelphia on March 1st, exhausted and still uncertain about the outcome of the operation. Thomas Garrett met her at a safe house and gave her the news. The fires had succeeded beyond their hopes. 37 plantations had reported record room fires. The Richmond office was destroyed. The slave trading industry was in chaos. But he also gave her the harder news. At least 3 people from the network had been caught and killed. Hannah in Maryland, Peter in North Carolina, a man whose name was never recorded in Virginia. Others had been sold south, their fates unknown. Tubman wept that night, the first time Garrett had ever seen her cry. She wept for the people who had died, for the people who would suffer because of what she had done, for the weight of responsibility that came with making decisions that affected so many lives. But she didn't regret it. When Garrett asked her if she would do it again, knowing the cost, she said yes without hesitation. "Freedom isn't free," she told him. "That's not just a saying, it's the truth. Every step toward freedom costs something, costs someone. The question isn't whether there will be a cost. The question is whether the cost is worth paying." She resumed her work with the Underground Railroad, making several more rescue missions in 1859 and 1860. But she was more careful now, more aware of the increased security and the heightened paranoia among slaveholders. The fires had made her work more dangerous, even as they had struck a blow against the system. And she never spoke publicly about what she had done. Never mentioned the fires, the network, the destruction of the breeding records. When asked about the gap in her rescue missions in 1858 and early 1859, she would simply say, "I had other work to do." The authorities never connected her to the fires. Her name never came up in the investigations. As far as the historical record shows, she spent early 1859 in Philadelphia, working quietly as a domestic servant, making no rescue missions, attracting no attention. But Thomas Garrett knew, Frederick Douglass knew, William Still knew, and they kept her secret, even in their private writings. The letters they exchanged about the events of February 1859 were carefully worded, using coded language, never mentioning Tubman by name, or providing details that could be used against her if the letters were intercepted. In March 1859, Douglass wrote to Garrett, "I have heard reports of the recent troubles in Virginia. If our friend had any involvement, I trust she is safe and will remain so. The work she has done, whatever its nature, will echo through history, though history may never know the full truth." Garrett replied, "Our friend is safe and continues her important work. What was done was necessary, though the consequences are complex. I believe future generations will understand, even if the present cannot." William Still, in his meticulous records of the Underground Railroad, made a single cryptic entry on March 5, 1859. Moses returned from a long journey. The journey was successful, but costly. We do not speak of it, but we remember. These fragments are all that remain in the contemporary record. Everything else is silence, gaps in the historical record, missing letters, destroyed documents. It wasn't until 1868, 3 years after the Civil War ended, that Tubman told the full story to a biographer named Sarah Bradford. Bradford was writing a book about Tubman's life, hoping to raise money to help Tubman, who was struggling financially despite her heroic service during the war. Bradford recorded the story in her notes, including details about the planning, the network, the fires, the destruction of the breeding records. But after hearing it, she made a decision that would keep the story hidden for another century. In her notes, discovered decades later, Bradford wrote, "Mrs. Tubman has told me an account of events in 1858-1859 that is so extraordinary, and the implications so troubling, that I fear it would damage her reputation rather than enhance it. The public wants to see her as a Moses figure, leading her people to freedom through faith and courage. They are not ready to see her as a revolutionary who organized sabotage and destruction of property on a massive scale. Moreover, the legal implications are concerning. Though slavery has ended, there are still those who might seek revenge or legal action for the destruction of property worth millions of dollars. For Mrs. Tubman's safety, and for the sake of her legacy, I have decided not to include this account in the biography. Better to let her be remembered for her rescue missions, which are heroic enough." Bradford's biography of Tubman was published in 1869 and became the standard account of her life for decades. It mentioned her rescue missions, her work as a scout and spy during the Civil War, her courage and faith. It said nothing about the fires of 1859. The notes containing the full story were filed away in Bradford's papers, forgotten for decades. In 1967, a graduate student named Patricia Chen, researching the Underground Railroad for her dissertation, discovered Bradford's notes in an archive at Syracuse University. She immediately recognized the significance of what she had found and began to investigate further. She found the fragment of Thomas Garrett's letter that had been photographed before disappearing. She found court records of ownership disputes following fires in February 1859. She found plantation records that mentioned the fires and the destruction of breeding records. She found newspaper accounts from the time that described the panic among slave traders. She pieced together the story, connecting dots that had been deliberately left unconnected for over a century. And she wrote an article titled "Harriet Tubman and the Fires of 1859, a Hidden Chapter in the Fight Against Slavery." She submitted it to the Journal of American History. It was rejected with a brief note: "Insufficient evidence for the claims made. The connections drawn are speculative and not supported by definitive documentation." She submitted it to the Journal of Southern History. It was rejected with a longer explanation. While the research is interesting, the conclusions are too controversial and not adequately supported. The suggestion that Harriet Tubman organized widespread arson is damaging to her legacy and requires more substantial proof. She submitted it to 2 more journals. Both rejected it. Chen's dissertation advisor suggested she drop the topic and focus on more conventional aspects of the Underground Railroad. When she refused, he warned her that pursuing this line of research could damage her career. Chen finished her dissertation without including the material about the fires. She got her PhD, got a teaching position at a small college, and continued to research the topic in her spare time. But she never published the article. The evidence was there, but the academic establishment wasn't ready to accept it. The story remained buried. In 2003, another researcher, a historian named Marcus Williams, was studying slave trading companies for a book about the domestic slave trade. He found a damaged ledger that had survived the Richmond fire. It had been in a filing cabinet on the second floor below the main blaze. The pages were charred and water-damaged, but some entries were still legible. On the last page, someone had written a note in pencil, probably added after the fire. Deliberate destruction suspected. Negro woman seen in area days before fire. Description: elderly, gray hair, stooped posture, spoke with accent suggesting Maryland origins. Name unknown, believed to be connected to Underground Railroad operations. Reward of $500 offered for information leading to identification and capture. The description matched Tubman's Mary disguise perfectly. The timing matched her presence in Richmond. The connection to the Underground Railroad pointed directly to her. Williams published his findings in a book about the slave trade, including a chapter about the fires of 1859. He suggested carefully, and with appropriate academic caution, that Harriet Tubman may have been involved in organizing the destruction of records. The book received mixed reviews. Some historians praised Williams for uncovering new evidence and asking important questions. Others criticized him for speculation and damaging the reputation of an American hero. The debate continues today. Some historians accept that Tubman was likely involved in the fires. Others remain skeptical, arguing that the evidence is circumstantial and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. But the evidence is there, scattered across dozens of sources, waiting for anyone willing to look. The gap in Tubman's rescue missions in 1858-1859, precisely when the planning and execution of the fires would have taken place. The coded references in letters between abolitionists who knew her. Bradford's unpublished notes describing Tubman's account of the events. The plantation records documenting fires on February 23-24, 1859. The court records of ownership disputes following the destruction of breeding records. The note in the damaged ledger describing a woman matching Tubman's disguise. The economic impact on the slave trading industry documented in business records and newspaper accounts. Each piece of evidence alone could be dismissed as coincidence or speculation. But together they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Why was this story suppressed? Why did even abolitionists who knew the truth choose not to tell it? Why has it taken over 150 years for the evidence to come to light, and why is it still controversial today? The answers are complicated and reveal uncomfortable truths about how we construct historical narratives and who we choose to celebrate as heroes. In the years immediately after the Civil War, there was a powerful desire among white Americans, even those who had opposed slavery, to present emancipation as something that had been given to enslaved people by enlightened white leaders. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator who freed the slaves with a stroke of his pen. The Union Army, which brought freedom to the South through military victory. This narrative was comforting. It allowed white Americans to feel good about themselves, to believe they had done the right thing, to see themselves as the heroes of the story. Stories of enslaved people fighting for their own freedom, organizing resistance, striking back against their oppressors. These didn't fit the narrative. They suggested that enslaved people were not passive victims waiting to be rescued, but active agents in their own liberation. They suggested that violence and destruction of property could be legitimate tactics in the fight against oppression. Even among abolitionists, there was discomfort with this idea. Many abolitionists were pacifists who believed in moral persuasion and legal change, not violent resistance. They celebrated the Underground Railroad because it was about rescue and escape, not about fighting back. They could admire Tubman for her courage in guiding people to freedom, but organized sabotage that destroyed millions of dollars in property was more problematic. There was also fear. Fear that telling this story would inspire similar actions, that it would suggest that organized resistance and destruction of property were legitimate tactics that could be used by any oppressed group. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when labor movements were growing and workers were organizing strikes and sometimes destroying factory equipment, the last thing the establishment wanted was a heroic narrative about property destruction as a tool of liberation. So the story was buried. Not through any single conspiracy, but through 1,000 small decisions to leave it out, to focus on other aspects of Tubman's life, to treat the documented evidence as unreliable or coincidental. When Sarah Bradford decided not to include the story in her biography, she set the template for how Tubman would be remembered. Subsequent biographies followed her lead, focusing on the rescue missions and Tubman's service during the Civil War. The fires of 1859, when mentioned at all, were treated as a mysterious series of accidents, unconnected to any organized resistance. As Tubman became a symbol of the abolitionist movement and later of the civil rights movement, there was increasing pressure to keep her image heroic but non-threatening. The conductor of the Underground Railroad, who guided people to freedom, was acceptable. She could be celebrated, put on stamps, taught about in schools. The strategic saboteur who destroyed millions of dollars in property and helped destabilize the slave economy was more complicated, more controversial, more difficult to fit into a simple narrative of American heroism. This sanitization of history is not unique to Tubman. It's a pattern that repeats throughout American history. We celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. for his dream of racial harmony, but we're less comfortable with his criticism of capitalism and his opposition to the Vietnam War. We celebrate Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat on a bus, but we don't talk as much about her decades of organizing work and her connections to more radical activists. We celebrate the American Revolution, but we're uncomfortable with the fact that it involved widespread destruction of property and violence against loyalists. We want our heroes to be simple, to fit into narratives that make us feel good about ourselves and our country. We want them to be brave but not too radical, to challenge injustice but not too fundamentally, to fight for change but through methods we find acceptable. The truth is usually more complicated. Harriet Tubman was not a simple hero. She was a complex person who made difficult decisions, who weighed costs and benefits, who understood that fighting oppression sometimes requires tactics that make people uncomfortable. She saved hundreds of people through her rescue missions, and that work was undeniably heroic. But she also organized an act of sabotage that caused massive economic damage, that led to increased repression in the short term, that resulted in people being killed. Was it worth it? Did the destruction of the breeding records actually hasten the end of slavery, or did it simply cause suffering without meaningful change? These are questions without easy answers. But they're important questions, and we can't answer them if we don't acknowledge what actually happened. The fires of February 1859 were real. The destruction of records was real. The economic impact was real. The increased repression that followed was real. And the evidence strongly suggests that Harriet Tubman was the architect of the entire operation. Does acknowledging this make her less of a hero, or does it make her more of one? A person who understood that fighting oppression requires more than just helping individuals escape, that it requires attacking the systems and structures that make oppression possible. Does it make her more complicated? Absolutely. Does it raise uncomfortable questions about tactics and consequences? Yes. Does it challenge our simple narratives about how change happens? Definitely. But that's exactly why this story needs to be told. History is not a collection of simple morality tales about heroes and villains. It's a complex tapestry of people making difficult decisions in impossible situations, of actions that have both intended and unintended consequences, of victories that come with costs and defeats that contain seeds of future success. Harriet Tubman deserves to be remembered as she actually was, not as a sanitized symbol, but as a real person who fought against slavery with every tool available to her. She guided people to freedom through the Underground Railroad. She served as a scout and spy during the Civil War. She led the Combahee River Raid that freed over 700 enslaved people. And she organized an act of sabotage that struck at the economic foundation of slavery. All of these things are true. All of them are part of her legacy, and all of them deserve to be remembered. Harriet Tubman spent the rest of 1859 and early 1860 continuing her rescue missions, bringing more people to freedom through the Underground Railroad. She made at least 8 more trips into slave territory, each one more dangerous than the last as security tightened and paranoia increased in the wake of the fires. When the Civil War began in 1861, she immediately volunteered her services to the Union Army. She worked as a cook and nurse at first, but her skills and experience quickly became apparent to military commanders. She was recruited as a scout and spy, using her knowledge of the South and her ability to move undetected through enemy territory. In June 1863, she led the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina, guiding Union gunboats up the river and coordinating with enslaved people on plantations to organize a mass escape. Over 700 enslaved people were freed in a single night, the largest liberation of enslaved people by a single person in American history. It was a military operation, sanctioned and supported by the Union Army, but it bore Tubman's signature: careful planning, perfect timing, and the use of networks within enslaved communities. After the war, she settled in Auburn, New York, where she had purchased property before the war began. She married a man named Nelson Davis, a former slave and Union veteran. She continued her activism, working for women's suffrage and establishing a home for elderly and indigent African Americans. She lived until 1913, dying at the age of 91. In her later years, she spoke often about her Underground Railroad work, about the people she had rescued, about the dangers she had faced. She became a celebrated figure, invited to speak at churches and meetings, honored by abolitionists and civil rights activists. But she never spoke publicly about February 1859, never mentioned the fires, the network, the destruction of the breeding records. When asked about the gap in her rescue missions in 1858 and 1859, she would simply say, "I had other work to do," and change the subject. She took the full story to her grave, or almost the full story. She had told Sarah Bradford, trusting that Bradford would know what to do with the information. Bradford chose to bury it, believing she was protecting Tubman's legacy. But secrets have a way of surfacing eventually. The evidence was scattered, but it survived. The letters, the notes, the records, the testimonies, they waited in archives and private collections, waiting for someone to piece them together. And now, over 150 years later, the story is finally emerging. Not complete. There are still gaps, still questions that may never be answered. We don't know the names of most of the people in the network. We don't know exactly how the communication system worked. We don't know what happened to many of those who participated. But we know enough to understand that Harriet Tubman was more than the simplified hero we've been taught about. She was a strategic genius who understood that fighting oppression requires attacking its foundations, not just helping individuals escape. She was willing to take enormous risks and to make decisions that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She understood that freedom has a cost, and she was willing to pay it. The fires of February 1859 were not an accident. They were an act of organized resistance, carefully planned and brilliantly executed. They struck a blow against the slave economy that reverberated for years. They showed that enslaved people could organize, could plan, could fight back against the system that oppressed them. And they were orchestrated by a woman who has been reduced in popular memory to a kindly conductor of the Underground Railroad, when she was actually one of the most effective resistance fighters in American history. This is the story America never wanted told. A story of property destruction and economic sabotage. A story of organized resistance and strategic violence against a system built on violence. A story that complicates our simple narratives about how slavery ended and who deserves credit for ending it. But it's a story that needs to be told, because Harriet Tubman deserves to be remembered as she actually was, not as a symbol, but as a person. A person who fought against slavery with every tool available to her. A person who made difficult decisions and lived with the consequences. A person who understood that sometimes, to change the world, you have to be willing to burn it down and build something better from the ashes. The breeding records were destroyed, the genealogies were erased. The economic foundation of the slave trade was shaken. And though slavery would continue for 6 more years until the end of the Civil War, the fires of 1859 were part of the accumulation of pressures that made the system unsustainable. Did Harriet Tubman hasten the end of slavery? We can't know for certain, but we can know this: she tried. She saw a way to strike at the heart of the system, and she took it. She organized dozens of people across 3 states to take action on the same night. She walked into the capital of Virginia, into the headquarters of the slave trading industry, and destroyed records that could never be fully replaced. And then she walked away, disappeared back into her work, and never spoke of it publicly again. That's the true story of Harriet Tubman. Not the whole story. No single story could capture the complexity of her life and work, but an important part of the story, a part that has been hidden for too long. A part that America never wanted told. Until now.